We're into the second week of 2023, and there's a lot to look forward to when it comes to the third week of this new calendar year. Of course, the Hockey World Cup has begun in India. It's going to be a fascinating event to watch. The Indian cricket team, the action for them never seems to stop. And there are going to be a whole lot of other things that are going to take place during this time. But we today at Express Sports Game Time have decided to talk about the beginning of the Grand Slam action of 2023 as Australian Open first round begins. Hi, I'm Rahul Pandey, and joining me today to do the heavy lifting when it comes to tennis is my colleague from the Indian Express Sports Desk, Namit Kumar. Hi, Namit. It's going to be a great event, but let's just begin talking about this with the fact that this is, of course, going to be the beginning of the post-Serena Williams, Roger Federer era in Grand Slam tennis. And just the 43 titles between them does speak a lot about them, but their effect on these events was beyond these titles, right? And now that we go into Australian Open 2023, what's the mood around for someone like you who watches tennis on a regular basis?
I think that their absence will affect those who don't watch it on a regular basis much more. And I think that what had happened with Serena and with Federer was that they were not really around for these events anyway. But it was just that their presence was looming in some way or another, and that added some kind of subtext for the casual viewers to watch. And I think that, that there was an era of tennis in which people were watching for the players and not really for the tennis. And once that ends, it's generally going to take a while for it to rebound. So I think that them not being there doesn't really affect the tennis, but it will definitely affect the eyeballs. That might be an issue if some of the big players lose early also.
Absolutely. And speaking of eyeballs here, I think, there have been quite a few pullouts from the competition already. Of course, when we talk about the Women's Championship, Ash Barty, who won Australian Open last time around, surprised quite a few people by announcing her retirement, 2 months after? And Naomi Osaka has, of course, while we are recording, given us the update via social media of her not participating in the competition, announcing a pregnancy. And when we go into the championships this year, we also spoke about the two players already, the two big players who you said, their absence is going to be a big thing. But when we talk about the presence, let's start with one Novak Djokovic, shall we? Returning to Australian Open after, quite some action off the field. Things in Australia have changed quite a lot since he last featured in this Grand Slam. There was that whole drama around COVID vaccine and his beliefs of and around it. And now that he comes into this competition this year, things in Australia themselves have changed. I mean, the last big event that took place in Australia, the T20 World Cup, there was a protocol in which the teams had in place a sort of a safeguard. Whenever one of their player gets COVID contracted, he can still play in the competition. And that whole belief, that whole thing has now changed in Australia. So going into this particular season, do you think Djokovic starts out as a favorite? Because last time around when Nadal, of course, won the men's championships, there was this thing, if Djokovic would have started, he would have, of course, won this. So now that he goes into this, waiting for that 22nd Grand Slam title of his, does he begin the competition as a favorite, as a clear-cut favorite?
Yeah, I think that's as easy as I can put it. I don't think there's anyone outside of him who's a bigger favorite. I think he'll be hungrier this year. At least that's what it seemed like. I saw him play in the tune-up tournament in Adelaide and he looked good. He looked sharp, but he also looked more motivated than usual at the start of a season. I had never really seen him like that at the start of a season, and I think that will probably have to do with the fact that what happened last year and, the whole storm that surrounded him. I have to say, I've been watching tennis for a while. What happened last year at the Australian Open is the most bizarre thing that I've seen happen at a Grand Slam event. it was the most like news heavy Grand Slam I've seen in a long time, and that was entirely about one player. And I don't think that Djokovic enjoys that, and he knows that there's a hangover from that. Like, it's still there anywhere he goes. He's constantly questioned about it. I presume every time he'll play a match, presumably win it, and he'll go into the press conference and he'll definitely be asked at least one question about it. So I think that that adds another layer to how motivated he's going to be to play. But, even without that, I just don't see anyone else being a clear favorite. He's, in my opinion, quite far ahead of the rest, especially considering that Nadal is not looking great and Medvedev is in a slump and Alcaraz had to pull out because of the injury. So it seems like, at least on the men's side, there's one very clear favorite.
Yeah. Yeah, and for just those who were living under some big rock and weren't aware of exactly what happened ahead of the 2022 Australian Open featuring Novak Djokovic, was the fact that he wasn't allowed to participate because of his anti-vaccine beliefs. At the time, of course, in Australia, there were very stringent COVID-19 vaccination protocols, and there was this whole drama on news channels 24/7 talking about why Djokovic is not being allowed to play, and then, his side of the things, and then the entire vaccine community sort of, getting in his favor. Of course, his fan base wanted him to feature in that competition. He couldn't. And then a year later, now we have him featuring in this competition as a clear-cut favorite. So a lot of things have changed in that respect. But you spoke about Rafa Nadal, and the defending champion, as it is, has a tricky fixture to begin his Australian Open journey against Jack Draper, who is 40th in the singles ranking at the moment. And, when we talk about Nadal, his big outing, I think, for generic tennis fans such as me, would have been that night at the Lever Cup court when he was holding hands with Roger Federer, bawling his eyes out. And, just that effect that his exit has had on him. I think he's been asked that question even after the event. I think it was just 1 month ago or so, probably, if I remember correctly, he was asked that question again of what Federer's exit from professional tennis means to him. And he said that the same answer that he gave almost 24 hours after that final appearance. A part of me has left alongside him. But Nadal fans will surely hope that's not the part that's won most Grand Slam in men's tennis history, right? He doesn't start as a favorite, but when you talk about that first round tricky fixture, how far do you see him going in this competition?
I think it's a nightmare draw for him. I think it's not just the first round. I think that if I see his entire path to the semi-final or the final, it's challenge after challenge after challenge. He'll have to get very lucky if he doesn't play at least 2 top 20 players before the quarterfinal. I don't think that usually happens to a top seed at a major. But yeah, I think 2 things that you touched on. The first was that the Federer retirement, the emotional nature of it for him. And I think that the sense that I'm getting from following him this last 1 month, I think that he's done now talking about it and done answering questions about his own retirement. I don't think that's coming anytime soon. But when it comes to how he's playing, that's a separate matter. He just hasn't played enough to be fit and sharp to enter a Grand Slam. And he's played 7 matches in 3 months and lost 6 of them. So that's just not enough match practice to be fit enough and sharp enough to come into a major and try to win the whole thing. So usually in situations like that, Nadal would want the first 2 or 3 matches to be a little on the easier side so he can play himself into form. But he has no choice, just his draw is pretty intense. He's got, if I'm not wrong, he's got Jack Draper, who's at the time of recording right now, he's playing a semi-final in Adelaide. So he's a very good player. I think his ranking at world number 40 it doesn't quite show how dangerous he can be. And before that ends, Nadal could possibly play Francis Tiafoe again in the 4th round. And Tiafoe is the player that beat him at the US Open 4th round. So there's a potential rematch of that. Then in the quarterfinal, he could take on Medvedev, who he played in that marathon comeback final last year. But even if it's not Medvedev, it could be someone like Herbert Hurkacz, who has just defeated him yesterday in a practice match in the Rod Laver Arena. So, his side of the draw is, I think if I look at that one quarter, I look at at least 4 players who I could see going to the semi-final. And they're all in the same eighth of the draw rather. So it's a nightmare for him. I don't see how he'll be able to play himself into form again. He'll probably have to be fit and ready to go. But I think that's the nature of tennis. Sometimes the results don't always say the full story. I saw his 2 matches in Australia at the United Cup. He lost both of them, but they were 3-hour-long matches against top 20 players, and he certainly passed the eye test. So it's tricky. The test is tough, but I don't think he's quite as bad as his results are saying. But yeah, uncertain for him given how tough his draw is.
Yeah, does sound tricky. But it's also the case with the favorite when it comes to the women's championship, Iga Swiatek, who will play her first round game against Yulia Nainier. And it's, I think, the rematch of their US Open 4th round match last time around in 2022. And it was a tricky game, as Swiatek said afterwards. So going into this Australian Open after that year, where she established really a freakish streak of winning run, a 37-match winning streak, winning her first US Open title, winning her second French Open title. Can she sort of pass and even follow up that year with an even greater performance this time around, starting from the Australian Open?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about Nadal having a tough draw. I think Swiatek has, I've never seen a women's draw at a major being this lopsided ever. I mean, just in her quarter, there are 4 other Grand Slam champions and 2 other finalists just in her quarter. And by the 4th round, she could have already played 3 Grand Slam champions. She's got a very tricky draw. I think Bianca Andreescu she could play her in the 3rd round and she's looking good. Wimbledon champion Elena Rybakina could be in the 4th round. Collins, Coco Gauff. There's so many players, I could name all of them. And Swiatek, but I think the hallmark of her year that you were talking about last year was just that it didn't, when she's looking good, it just doesn't matter who's on the other side of the net. Peak game to peak game, she's the best against any player. Doesn't matter what form they're in or what results they've got. But I think her first round is interesting because that was the match in the US Open where she really struggled. And it didn't look like watching her play in that match that she'll win that tournament. And she ended up doing so. And I think that was a real catalyst moment for her where she could even learn to get results when she's not at her best. So it's interesting that she's playing Niema in the first round. But I think with Swiatek, I don't think even an early exit in the Australian Open, given how tough her draw is, I don't think that'll suddenly mean that she's not going to be able to replicate some of the things she did last year. But in terms of a favorite for the women's draw, I can't say it's Swiatek because her draw is just way too tough. I would rather go with Ons Jabeur, who's the 2nd seed and in good form and with a much easier draw.
Yeah, but on Swiatek, I think last year, while she was on that winning streak, in the later half of that winning streak, I just had to continuously Google her age because 21 right now is, you just wonder what bigger things she can achieve in her career going forward, right? And I think you also must have read this recent article of her for the Players Tribune, where she talks about being this icon in Poland now, where people recognize her just by her voice. And she, of course, title of the piece being, the story of a Polish introvert. And it's tough to sort of fathom what it must have been after winning that French Open to be invited to the presidential palace along with her parents and to be followed by the paparazzi right from her place all the way to the presidential palace. And of course, now that people recognize her by her voice, they surely wouldn't make it easy for her to just stroll around the streets of Warsaw. So it's quite the story for millennials to follow, right?
You touched upon something that's very important here. When she had won that French Open, it was very obvious that she's got an incredibly powerful game and the kind of power where she can take up the advanced court positioning without it being a threat to her because she can shorten the rally so easily. She's good on her serve. She very rarely looks phased even when the return game of her opponent is good or if the ground strokes of her opponent are good. She looked like a great player who plays well when everything is going her way. And I think it's interesting you mentioned that Players Tribune article, because I read it. And even what happened at the US Open last year, it didn't seem like she came in a very positive mindset into the tournament. In the first few matches, she looked a little shaky. And I think that reading what she said about, being an icon in Poland and, just the enormous amount of attention on her, the maturity is now setting in. And it's brutal. Look, tennis can be brutal in itself, but for a 21-year-old to be the world number one is in particular quite brutal. You have to grow up much quicker than the rest of us. The level of maturity in Swiatek has set in where I can tell you that even if on Tuesday she loses her first round to Niema, I don't think that will phase her for the rest of the year at all. I think she'll be able to reset easily and go on and have another incredible year. And I think that's I'm glad you asked me that, because I think that is the aspect of her game and her presence on tour in general, is that can she only do it when things are going her way? And I think this level of maturity that has set in from the media attention and from everything that's followed her ever since she won that French Open, because of that, there is no ceiling anymore. I can see her being one of the dominant players in women's tennis for the next 2-3 years at least.
Really sounds scary when you consider that age of hers, and of course the Polish athlete to follow at the moment. And I think Robert Lewandowski will agree. But yeah, moving forward, Namit, as we try and wrap this up, who are the other players and the other storylines when it comes to the 2023 Australian Open that you would be looking at, and that you think that some of the generic tennis viewers such as I should follow?
I think the dominant story, and just because we're trying to look at it with depth doesn't mean that we can't say the obvious thing. I think the obvious storyline is going to be what happens around Nadal and Djokovic. And because Nadal will, the first few matches are very tricky for him, and we'll be able to see whether he's in it or not. And with Djokovic, we'll be able to everyone will be able to notice that hunger that he has to redeem himself for what happened last year. But I think that there are a couple of people who can surprise in the draw. I think Coco Gauff is looking very, very good, even though her year last year didn't end that well. But I think she started it this year with winning the title in Auckland, and she's also got a tough draw. She's on Swiatek's side of the draw, but if a few things go her way, she's definitely one to look out for. The 17 and 15-year-old Czech sisters, Linda and Brenda Frevitova, both of whom us Indian tennis fans would know, played in Chennai, and Linda won the title. They are very exciting talents, and they might pull off one or two surprises. So I would be excited about watching them play. And I also think that there are some pretty exciting first round matches. Matteo Berrettini is playing Andy Murray in the first round, which is a brutal fixture for Murray. Dominic Thiem, most people would have forgotten about him, but he is back and he got a wild card into the draw, and he's playing Andrei Rublev, 5th seed in the first round. Great first round match. Again, brutal draw for Thiem. And on the men's side, the two players I'm looking forward to seeing the most are the American duo, Taylor Fritz, who's got a great draw, and Frances Tiafoe. And it'll be interesting to see if Tiafoe gets Nadal in the 4th round again, if he can repeat what he did with the home crowd on his side at the US Open. So I think there are a lot of storylines, and obviously they'll unravel as the event goes. But if I have to guide anyone on what to watch, I would say that very, very rarely do you get such great opening round matches and first 3 round matches at a major. It's very rare. And I think this time it's happened. So if on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, people are procrastinating work or people are procrastinating studying, and in the morning they want to watch some tennis, they have a lot of options.
Well, there you go. Set up your itineraries, calendars marked, and the Australian Open first round, of course, begins on Monday, January 16th. We will be here to talk about the big developments. You know what you have to do to know of the big developments. Just log on to theindianexpress.com. Thank you so much, Namit, for joining us. Thanks to our producer, Shashank, in the background. And thanks, as always, to you, our listeners.
You were listening to Express Sports by the Indian Express. This week's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.